Hey, Tierraney, how are you?
Hi, I'm doing great. How about yourself?
I'm doing well. Thank you for joining me. Even though the weather in Texas right now is not the best, I appreciate your time today.
Yes, trying to stay warm.
Trying to stay warm. Would you mind introducing yourself, your name, your role, and your path to education?
Absolutely. So, my name is Tierraney Richardson, and I have had the amazing pleasure to serve as the founding assistant principal of instruction for a remote learning academy for a larger charter management organization. As well, I've been able to add on to my work serving as a blended learning coordinator as well, and that spans across our district's 4 regions. And so, that's been awesome because it's been our attempt at addressing unfinished learning. As far as how I got into this work, a little over a decade now, I joined an amazing program called Teach for America. Some have heard of it, some haven't, but it's a national nonprofit organization who believes that every child, regardless of zip code, deserves the right to attain an excellent education. And when I found out about that, I was really aligned with that. Mission and vision and wanted to become a part of the solution when we think about the problem that is educational inequity.
Mhm. How do you, I mean, we all know that the educational system, not for lack of trying, oftentimes is not equitable. How has that shown up in your work?
Yeah, so I believe like one way that that was showing up was when we even think about the pandemic. And so the reason why there was even a remote learning academy established in my particular organization was because they realized that, yes, we want to return back in person and we want to, move past what we've experienced with COVID, but that just wasn't actually a reality.
Mhm.
And we were realizing that, wow, students were actually missing a lot of instruction due to having to quarantine or due to having COVID themselves, even if, it might have not been themselves. Sometimes it was just their family members. So they had to stay home and they were missing out on a lot of instruction. And that, in and of itself, when I'm a part of an organization who believes in championing equity for kids, that's not too equitable when they're at home and they're not able to receive that quality education. So I really think that that was one way that inequitable practices kind of showed up, and I was really applauding my district for their efforts to really address that um, equity issue.
Yeah. And when we think about remote academies, some folks say that's a version of homeschool. Not to say that it's not incredibly impactful.
Right.
How do you how do you structure that in such a way, right? Because I think during COVID, a lot of folks were saying, though the raw materials were available, while you had a person on the screen, so to speak, parents did and should play a really, I would say, outsized role oftentimes in making sure that the students um, are showing up to class number one and signing on. It's kind of like the bare minimum. But then also, as a parent, how do you support the work of remote learning in a way that you feel would lead to a good partnership between home and school? Like, how do we make that equitable? Knowing that some parents are working, they don't have the capacity or the resources all of the time to be available while their students are learning.
Absolutely. That is definitely a reality and challenges that we've had to overcome. But I think just keeping clear lines of communication. So, for example, when our students were, coming down with COVID or family member had COVID and they had to quarantine, one thing that we did is really make sure that we had really streamlined communication with their in-person campus. And then from there, having kind of this like mini onboarding process with their caretakers in order to make sure that the students were really set up for success. I think one big thing that wasn't always equitable that we saw when the pandemic first hit is like not all of our students even had access to reliable technology or Wi-Fi signals. So even as we were thinking about the remote academy, it was making sure that, hey, do students all have a Chromebook that they can take with them, because you never know, when you're going to test positive for, COVID. And so making sure that they were taking that with them as they were going from, in person to coming home every day just in case they needed to stay remote until they were able to test negative again, and making sure that even our students had, hotspots that they could use if needed, if they didn't have, reliable internet access, and, different things like that. But I really think that mini onboarding really helped to set our students' families up for success, because they knew that they would be well taken care of and still receiving a quality education, even though they were with us for such a temporary time until they returned back in person.
Yeah. There are a few schools who are, like yours, either experimenting or fully launched a remote aspect of the schooling experience. How do you ensure that there's community, right? I think one of the things that, one of the benefits of being in a brick and mortar school is this idea of community building, making sure that you feel connected to other learners in your classroom, with your teachers, and the entire school community. What advice would you give to folks who are trying to cultivate that same feeling, but they're fully remote, or a portion of their program is remote?
Yeah, well, one big thing that we believe in is creating brave and belonging spaces for our students, regardless of what that looks like. And one thing that I'm really proud of is the way that we were still able to intentionally weave SEL practices into the virtual environment. We even have something that we call our 5-minute conferences or 5-minute check-ins, where we're able to really intentionally build that community amongst our students, and then also our students with the relationships that they have with their staff or their particular teachers. And so I feel that that is one way that we've been able to address it. Another thing is that in person, one big thing that my organization does is these school-wide community meetings. And it's like, we knew that that was such a big and important part of our culture. And so making sure that even in person, as they transition virtually, that we were still able to do those weekly community meetings. And so that we were able to really, again, foster that sense of community amongst our students.
Yeah. Where do you see remote learning going 5 years from now? Right. I think we've learned a lot of lessons since COVID, and we're certainly still learning lessons. But where do you see this going, either at your organization or across the country in 5 years?
Yeah, and so one interesting thing is I feel that people were so eager to return back in person because they felt that was the best way that kids could learn. But I
Right.
really feel that, from the data that we've been able to showcase with our remote academy, we've been able to show that, students are able to learn in this unique and innovative way. And so as I think about the future, I really see even more remote academies popping up. I know particularly here in Texas, our education agency did make it where districts could apply to have these actual virtual schools in addition to their brick and mortar campuses. And so I believe that's definitely a step in the right direction. And we talked a lot, I remember, as I scrolled through, Twitter threads online during the pandemic, I continued to see people talk about, yes, we need to reimagine education. And they were, so excited and giving a lot of lip service, for lack of better words, because it's kind of like once things were able to even out a little bit and we were able to kind of return to as normal as we possibly could be, a lot of those innovative practices were kind of thrown out the window. So I really see us as a front runner being able to say that, like, this is something that we kept around because we saw that it was good for kids.
Yeah. There's a lot of, I think sometimes we conflate. I know I have, until I was better educated about this idea of remote learning, people are wondering, I have wondered, the difference between remote learning and personalized learning. Oftentimes when we think about technology in learning, we're thinking more about how do we personalize learning experience for each individual child. How do you marry those two?
That is a really good question. As I think about that, I think that weaves a little bit into the work that I'm also doing as like blended learning coordinator. And that is really setting a very clear and intentional vision, because a lot of the times when we hear blended learning and what we've seen in the past, this is kind of part of like a 3-year rollout. In year one, it was a lot of, okay, so we're taking this remote learning and we're going to have all of our schools that are in person do sort of like a blended learning model, like I was mentioning earlier, to kind of address unfinished learning. And what we saw to be true was that a lot of students were handed that Chromebook and said, okay, go to your Clever portal and log on, and you're going to complete X, Y, and Z assignments. Here's your journal. And like sitting in front of a screen and just like click, 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 clicking. And that is really not best practice. I will say that much. And so as I kind of think about the differences from remote instruction, it is truly still taking that student-centered approach, making sure that we are able to differentiate to meet the needs of students, that we're able to leverage this technology as like just simply a complement to what we're already doing well in the classroom, and just using that. I know one particular platform that we utilize, it allows for students to actually get live help, and really partnering with these different blended learning platforms in that particular way, and being able to leverage that real-time help and instruction, and making sure that, again, it's really clear on the vision on how we're going to leverage this in order to be able to serve kids and continue, like we've been saying, championing equity. So I think in a way that would be my approach to answering that question.
Great. You touched on this equity thing, and as you're speaking, I'm thinking about students, our special populations. So for example, I'm a parent of a child with special needs, and I'm wondering if other parents are in that situation, how does blended learning, how does remote learning also address some of their needs that are meant to be supported through their IEPs?
Yeah, well, I can kind of, give an example of what we do. I know that we have someone who is the SPED coordinator. And, I like to actually refer to that more so as like our approach to neurodiversity. So I call her our neurodiversity coordinator. But anywho, we make sure that, again, the communications with the brick and mortar campuses are really streamlined, so that if we do have a student who's coming in and they might have, a 504 or an IEP, that we're able to intentionally have that information in a timely manner, and that we're able to actually provide the appropriate support so that students are taken care of, regardless of what accommodations or modifications they might need in order to be successful.
What questions are you asking yourself these days, right? So you've now been in this role for a bit. You're seeing it evolve, and you're seeing a lot of successes, I imagine. But I'm sure you're also recognizing, opportunities for further enhancement. So what questions are you asking yourself around how to make this experience for your educators and your communities even more impactful?
That is a really great question. I'm asking myself so many different ways, like, what are ways that we can continue to develop our staff so that they feel well supported in this work? A lot of our staff that we have some of them transferred from their brick and mortar campuses within our network, but others came from outside of the work. And so making sure that we're thinking of ways that we can best meet the needs of our staff so that they feel really equipped to be able to serve students well. I think that's one particular question that's always coming to mind. Another question is, how can or how can we, as like our leadership team, make sure that we talked a little bit about earlier, creating this sense of community amongst students, but how can we do that in this remote environment to create that same sense of community with our staff, so that they really still feel seen and heard, because you don't have those conversations that you can typically have when you're just walking down the hallway or walking in the lounge really quickly in person. So what are ways that we can intentionally bring about, those kind of moments, so that it's a brave and belonging space for our staff as well? I think those are two questions that would be top of mind for me.
Yeah, and I asked that question specifically because a lot of times we all have very similar questions about our work. And I think the beauty of being educators is that we're not doing this alone, right? And there are a lot of people who are grappling with some of the same opportunities and issues. Some of us have found varying levels of success. And so, thinking about what we need to do thinking about what we should be thinking about, I often find to be very, very helpful. But Tierraney, I definitely appreciate your time today. This has been quite amazing. And I'm sure that folks who are also thinking about how to launch successful remote academies will learn a great deal from this. So thank you.
Yes, thank you for having me, Richard.
Of course.